Welcome into another episode of Steelers Afternoon Drive. I'm Zachary Smith, joined by Nick Farabaugh, not Alan Saunders today. The reason that we are having Nick on today is what we're going to have as our main talking point. Pitt Pro Day today, and there's obviously some Steelers interest there, as well as obviously interest from around the league in the Pitt product coming out into the league. But Nick, how we doing?
Yeah, man, we're doing well. This is my first actual drive.
It is.
We're doing this like an Alan Saunders mid-season episode where he's driving home from practice, and I'm driving home from Pitt Pro Day right now, so ready to talk about it.
This is definitely a throwback. Yeah, this is like the how there's in-season Hard Knocks. This is the in-season Alan Saunders POV that we are getting today from Nick Farabaugh. So, but excited to talk about it, get some takeaways from Pitt's Pro Day. Obviously, this is Steelers Afternoon Drive, so we want to talk about Steelers interest here. And Nick, there's a couple guys at Pitt that the Steelers have kind of showed continued interest in along the way. And between the two, MJ Devonshire, Matt Goncalves, like which one do you think that there's certainly more interest in, or like what are your thoughts on those fits for those guys? Should the Steelers actually take them?
Yeah, I think the more interest is probably in Goncalves. I think, we're talking about a mid-round tackle option right there, and we really only have two of those right now that we know that they have interest in between him and Travis Glover. Those two guys, and Goncalves is a guy that was at the Shrine Bowl, that they have familiarity with, was at the Combine. They interviewed him at both places. He fits an Arthur Smith tackle. He's a big dude, but he's really athletic and get out in space. Pretty steady pass protector. Kind of raw still. He's not super developed, but he's a better run protector, probably a better pass protector than he is run blocker right now, which is kind of interesting that they're kind of looking at that, because for the most part, they've looked at guys that have been run blockers, I feel like, more than anything. But it's an absurd tackle class. So Goncalves might go day 2 in this class, maybe with that second, third round pick. Could make sense. I think Devonshire is interesting. He's about 5'11", almost 6 foot, but can play in the slot, can probably play outside, played a little bit of safety at Pitt. They tried him there, moved him back outside, obviously played in that quarter scheme that puts them on an island a lot. So I think both of them are viable targets. Goncalves is probably the guy that maybe goes either with that 98th pick or maybe at 119 if he falls a little bit. They're looking for a mid-round tackle option rather than, say, a top tackle option. I think he makes a lot of sense. He's got a top 30 visit with them scheduled. So the interest is very real there for Matt Goncalves, and then a local visit that won't count against their official 30 visits from MJ Devonshire. That one kind of feels more of like, we always bring in everybody from the Pittsburgh area, and they do for workouts. But he fits what they like. He fits that type of a physical guy that can play in man-to-man coverage. So I think Goncalves is probably a little bit more likely, but hey, with one of those 6th-round picks, Devonshire does make sense.
Goncalves too. I wonder if he's played at both tackle spots as well as guard. So, we've seen them appreciate guys a little bit more that have the position versatility, whether the fans like that or not, because, you want a guy to have a home and be able to stay there and get better and develop at that position. But, I think that that's probably an intriguing thing for the Steelers too, is the fact that he has experience at, different spots along the offensive line, basically everywhere besides center. But as a pro, where do you think that he projects to play? Do you think that he would play on the right side, or do you think that maybe he could be a long-term left tackle project?
Has played significant snaps on both sides. I don't think he's one of those guys that doesn't really strike you as a true leader. He's like a true swing tackle. So for the Steelers' philosophy, like, that makes a lot of sense. And he played a lot more on the left, or was supposed to, at least with Carter Warren. And he did a little bit more, but has played a lot on the right. I think he probably profiles wherever you really need to fit him in. I think he profiles as a tackle. His arm is about 33 and 7/8 inch length. The Steelers under Andy Weidel have kind of looked at 34-plus inch arms. That has kind of been a benchmark for them. It seems like it's going to be another benchmark for them this time around, too, just with interest in guys like Glover and Latham and Mims and other guys like that. But Fuaga obviously is right on that line too. So I expect them to kind of look at Goncalves as probably a swing tackle. And I think he can play on the left or the right. I don't really think he's more natural on either side. I just think that's, as you mentioned, kind of something the Steelers do, but that's kind of something Pitt's old offensive line coach Dave Borgley did too, where he just forced them to play on both sides and get used to it. And so I think Goncalves is actually one of those guys that is kind of one of those versatile players. So for the Steelers, I would assume he would slot in probably right tackle, just so you can get Broderick Jones back at left.
Goncalves, MJ Devonshire. Is there anybody else that you think could make any sense at all? To AJ Woods, probably a slot in the NFL. I don't know if he makes sense for what the Steelers are looking for. If there might be some redundancy there with Dante Jackson on the roster in terms of the profile, or Bub Means, who seems to be a little bit of a riser at the receiver position as we go through this process, or anybody else. Is there anybody else that was at Pitt's Pro Day today that you think, okay, this guy could make some sense at some point?
Yeah, I think Means is interesting just because he's a big height, weight, speed guy. Kind of the type of guy that you look at and really like his field stretching ability. So I think there's some things to like with Bub Means. He's got a lot of interest, man. Like, he's a guy that I didn't know when he declared if he was going to go earlier than round 6 or 7, but sure seems like he's going to go top 150. There's a lot of teams interested in him.
Which, like, in this class, that's...
Yeah, man. Class, like, he's kind of an interesting player in this class too, because down the board there's not a lot of these like big field stretching guys that can just take the top off the defense. Like, I feel like he's kind of a rarity in the day 3 pool, and so I think a lot of teams are going to really kind of draw to that as kind of an interesting wide receiver 4 with developmental upside, because he's got really good athleticism. He doesn't have like great quickness, but he was a guy that was 6'2". He weighed in today at 227. Told me his playing weight is around 220-ish, and man, he ran a 4.43 at the combine. Like, he can fly. He's got great explosiveness. So he's a guy that I think has kind of taken strides, has pedigree, and definitely is an interesting player. I just don't know if the Steelers are going to be the team to look at that. They have field stretchers on the team, if not 4, depending on kind of what Van Jefferson does this season. But Van Jefferson has held that role before with the Rams, so he's a scheme fit. I just think he's a bit of a redundant player considering what they have at the receiver position. I think Woods could make sense, in that late round period. Extremely athletic player, ran a 4.3 today, crushed the agilities. He's a smart dude. He's a track athlete. I don't know how much ball production is going to be there, and I don't know how much the Steelers are going to look at that. I think there's other guys that they're going to look at in the slot, for example, like Mike Sanders still, that are really going to pop off this page to them. And if not, I also expect them to maybe go into that free agent pool after and maybe look, at re-signing a guy like Mike Sullivan or bring back Patrick Peterson. Or there's other guys out there, K'Wan Williams, Vontae Maddox. Like, there are guys out there in the slot. I was a big fan of maybe adding Miles Bryant before he got signed this past season. But there's enough options out there for the Steelers in the slot. Woods could be like a late option, but I mean, the Steelers do have other vets on the roster that have slot experience, like Josiah Scott too. So we'll kind of see. Obviously, you can't trust any of those guys, but Woods is a late round pick. I think could make some sense. But I think obviously the top 2 guys, given the fact that we know they have visits set up with the Steelers, are Devonshire.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of visits set up with the Steelers, Nick, this is absolutely a shocking revelation for us, but Amarius Mims going to have a top 30 with the Pittsburgh Steelers. You've tweeted multiple times just the name Amarius Mims, no other context added, nothing else needs to be said. I think if someone were to ask me right now who I think the Steelers are going to take, and I have to put like money on it, I have to make a prediction, it's Amarius Mims, and I think that you fall into that same boat.
I do, man. Listen, that's all I've heard all kind of draft cycles, how much this team loves Amarius Mims. Now, I don't know if he's going to make it to 20. I think that's my biggest reservation. There's just so many tackle-needy teams before them. That run's starting really with the Jets. The Jets need one. It seems like the Saints need one now. Ryan Ramczyk's status is in doubt this he could be an option there. You talk about the Bengals. I mean, there's more teams in there that could use a tackle. And that's before even, accounting for what if the Bears trade down. That's a tackle team. The Bengals need a tackle. It's a very tackle needy group. The Seahawks could draft a tackle just because Abraham Lucas's knee is kind of a question mark too. Like, there's a lot of questions. Does Amarius Mims make it to 20? If he makes it to 20, I think he's the pick. If we're going by pro day kind of okay or Con and Tomlin there, receiver doesn't seem to be it. It seems to be either corner or tackle. And listen, they haven't been there for centers. Like, they weren't there for Jackson Powers Johnson. I guess we'll see if they're going to be there for Zach Frazier at pro day, his Big 12 pro day this week. They'll be going later in the week. So that'll be interesting if Frazier's there. But again, Frazier, in round one question. Graham Barton's pro day is tomorrow. So there are a few. Washington pro day, though. If they go to Washington pro day, I mean, Troy Fatanu is on that list then.
Yeah.
To me, I've seen a lot of the sentiment that tackle seems less likely because the needs the Steelers have. Like, they don't have a center on roster. They don't have a slot corner on roster. They clearly need to draft a receiver. But, a lot of the interest is pointing to right now, Zach, to me, it's pointing to a first-round tackle. Now, I don't know how they're going to kind of fill that in or what they're going to ignore and make weaker to kind of address tackle in the first round. I think it's a smart move to address tackle in the first round. I've kind of said that before. I don't think Dan Moore is a starting caliber left tackle in the NFL. I do think he is a solid swing tackle, but I would like the pick of Amarius Mims. So I just kind of look and say, okay, you take tackle round one, well, then it feels like you have to take Frazier or Van Pran or someone like that, or what's the plan at center?
Yeah.
Receiver, less of a question. I think we kind of know how deep receiver is in this draft.
Sure.
Player in round three. But I think taking a tackle in round one is okay, so you're upgrading the tackle spot, moving Roger Jones back to left tackle. Smart move is just, all right, how are you addressing all of the other big needs on the roster?
I'll be honest, when you say that, we're going to talk about the receiver room in a little bit because we have on the show, but I want to get your thoughts on it as well because it's been a while since you've been on here and the Steelers have made some movement there in their receiver room. But to me, that is, if I was taking a guess as to what they are going to, ignore at least for the first couple of rounds 1 and 2, I would guess that it's receiver right now, and not because it's not a need on the roster, but more so because they've made some additions there. Granted, they're not needle moving, but in Arthur Smith's offense, where most of the time, obviously there was one season where we've seen AJ Brown and Corey Davis both get theirs. It's just not a high volume passing offense to be able to feed multiple mouths. I mean, I mentioned it yesterday to Alan. 34 total targets in the slot for receivers in Atlanta last year. That's not just one receiver getting 34 total targets. The slot position in general had 34 targets to it last year in Atlanta. And I question if there's not necessarily the need for receiver talent, but how utilized receiver talent will be within this offense outside of George Pickens.
Yeah, man. Listen, I don't care what offense you run. I understand the Arthur Smith offense is less oriented, but I still remain kind of true to the point that you need really good receivers, because a big part of the Arthur Smith offense has been great when it plays ahead, but if you can't play ahead and you have to start throwing the ball out of 11 personnel and start going to shotgun, that's when it can really deconstruct. And that's when it becomes an issue, because you put the onus on a quarterback that maybe you don't trust. Now, maybe the Steelers think, a Russ or a Justin Fields can kind of do that, but they don't have a ton of receiver talent right now. It's a big question for me. I think,
Yeah. Well, and also, I don't disagree. I want to preface by saying that this is me trying to see what their vision is and trying to understand the way they've gone about building this receiver room, because I can't say that I'm in lockstep with the way that they've done so.
It's kind of interesting because the two guys they've added aren't even the Haas blockers that you would think they would have added, right?
Yeah.
Think that they would have added a guy that can really block his behind off, and they really haven't. There's not a guy in that room right now that is a great blocker.
No, Van Jefferson's okay, I guess. I've seen some, yeah.
He's fine. Pickens, is solid when he really puts his mind to it. But there's not a ton in there right now that's dude, that's a receiver that really gets after it in blocking. That's maybe not on the bottom of the roster like a guy like Marquez Callaway or Denzel do that. But their roster spots are obviously no lock. And then you kind of, with Quez Watkins signing, kind of doubled up on the Calvin Austin type. So it feels like one of those two guys is probably not making the team.
See, I asked you about that yesterday.
Yeah.
I was curious what your thought was. Because here's the thing, Nick, I was looking at it, and not to say everybody has to be of the same mindset as me, but I was almost looking at it as these additions being, Van Jefferson basically being a replacement for Allen Robinson. Again, he's not like as good of a blocker, but I think that he is probably the best in the room right now and can fill some of that duty. And I was wondering if we would see both Quez Watkins and Calvin Austin make the roster, or if it was really them battling for one spot and we still could see another addition at wide receiver even before the draft, or what your thoughts on that were.
It certainly seems like to me, man, that we're likely going to see them draft a guy that can really block, or at the very least can bring something different. Like, for example, with Quez Watkins and Calvin Austin III now on the roster, like, I don't expect them to draft Xavier Worthy. That's an example to me that doesn't make as much sense.
Yeah.
Someone that does make more sense now is, for example, a Ricky Pearsall, or a Jalen Polk, or a Jalen McMillan, Malachi Corley, someone like that.
Roman Wilson.
Yeah, Roman Wilson. Those guys make a lot of sense that they could target, and they've kind of been, to me, I think they've been targeting pretty heavily that day 2-ish area, round 2, round 3 types of guys. Look at their visits for top 30. It's Corley, Pearsall, Leggett. There's a few guys in there, and then you look at their formals, and you can expand that list to guys like Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan that really block well. And so there are kind of this. They've kind of stacked, in my opinion, these kind of types, and I expect them to get a rugged type that blocks, a tough player, and that can create in different ways. And I think, a guy like Corley, who they formally met with, bringing him in for top 30, Zach Gazani was at his pro day, makes a lot of sense. So I just think there's a lot of different bodies there, but on day 2, I think they could find so many different types. But I think it's got to be a specific type of guy.
Listen, Cordero Patterson isn't going to preclude them from drafting anybody, but I was wondering if you thought at all that would change any draft plans. And we actually got a question about that, so might as well bring that up now. Berg Sports Fan said, with the addition of Cordero Patterson, despite him being primarily a running back as of late and also being brought in just to be the kick returner, do you think that he changes draft plans at all in the receiver room? Like with Malachi Corley, a guy that you can get the ball in a lot of different ways and also utilize as a running back, would that make him off of the table?
I don't think so. I think it obviously takes running back 3 off the board. But I don't think it changes their plans to draft a Malachi Corley or a Xavier Leggett. Because, I think while Cordero Patterson did play a lot out wide in the slot last year, you go look at his PFF snaps, and it's pretty dead even, actually, between that and the backfield. I think while he's a cool little weapon to use, I think a guy like Corley, for example, is obviously a yak king, but also a guy that you can use in different formations. And he's more of a true receiver, whereas Patterson's kind of this weapon X that you just move around everywhere. Like, he's a cool wrinkle that you add. I think Corley would actually be, the 2 in this offense, and also would be a really good blocker. And I think that's the distinction. I think blocking is going to be really key because of what Arthur Smith asked his wide receiver 2 to do, which is to insert up on those kind of behind the tackle or behind the tight end's hip, go after, dig out those box safeties. So a guy like Corley makes sense to me. And I don't think Patterson kind of precludes that. So I think, is there some overlap between the two? Yeah. But I also think, Arthur Smith's a guy that uses a lot of screens, tries to get manufactured touches to guys like that. So, that makes sense to get a guy like Corley and then add a guy like Patterson because, listen, a guy like Corley, who is a guy that plays so physical and is so yak-oriented, we have seen this with Debo already, where sometimes, dude, that play style just doesn't hold up over a season. It can be tough, right?
Yeah.
That guy to play 17 games. So, that is really hard for me to fully buy into. Like, okay, Malachi Corley's going to have like 120 receptions. Like, it's probably not going to happen. And so I think Cordero is kind of a nice way to take some pressure off a guy like that if you're adding him. But I don't think it precludes them from drafting Malachi Corley or Xavier Legette or any one of those yak-oriented kind of running back build types of guys.
Sure. I mean, Cordero's been a relatively healthy guy throughout his career here, but he's also 32 years old, so like, and he's only on a 2-year contract. Like, that's not the type of player at his age. And, albeit still a productive player, and I think he's going to add something, certainly with the new kickoff rules, that should, preclude you from drafting somebody. So, we're in agreement there. I think that pretty much everybody that you mentioned is certainly still in play. But we kind of touched on the wide receiver room, overall there anyway. But like, not necessarily just getting into overlap or what guys bring and don't bring. What have been your overall thoughts about the additions to this receiver room? Because like when we traded Deontay Johnson, I think everybody was kind of expecting more of a bigger splash at the position, even if like Tyler Boyd, probably not considered a bigger splash, but like people know the name. But obviously all the names that we talked about in the trade market as well, they were sniffing around. So what have been your overall thoughts on what they've done with the receiver room to this point?
I don't know. It's not needle moving to me. Like the guys they added are wide receiver depth moves. Because really, as you mentioned, like with how much Arthur Smith plays out of 12 and 13 personnel or multiple running back sets, like 11 personnel is not the most used personnel. Usually 12 is. And so a wide receiver 3 in the offense can absolutely be a guy that like you consider a depth player. Like that is something that is unique to his offense. And so, Van Jefferson, Quez Watkins, these are all depth guys. I think Quez Watkins, like one of those guys might not even make the team. Like it's possible.
Yeah.
A guy like Quez Watkins loses the job to Calvin Austin. Like that's possible. So like, I don't think it's a guarantee there. I think Van Jefferson will make the team. I think he's kind of an interesting player that, has a little bit of route running ability, can stretch the field a little bit, can do some interesting things for you if you scheme him up right. So I think that's kind of interesting. But nothing has moved the needle. If you are looking at a wide receiver room right now in the NFL, outside of George Pickens, there's not a guy in that room that's a top 10 receiver on a playoff winning roster. Like there's not. So they can find a rookie that can be that too, for sure. Again, I wouldn't be that surprised if they sign another guy. Like I don't know if sign Boyd. It doesn't feel like that's going to happen anymore. Price tag feel a little rich. But I mean, there are still some names out there that they could look at. That might be like one of those things where they draft a guy and then come around training camp. Maybe there's a name out there that's still there, and they go out and sign. So that's kind of what that is to me. But like Van Jefferson and Quez Watkins just kind of fill out the depth. Maybe it takes away kind of that double dip at receiver. Like maybe that's what it is, where you're not gonna draft 2. I still think they could, depending on kind of what they get with that first pick. But it's not like gonna preclude you from making another splash. You could still sign another guy and draft a guy. So it doesn't really take that much outside of, all right, you really don't need to sign another depth guy, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen a lot of mocks where the Steelers are double dipping, taking another receiver like Jalen Coker or something somewhere down the line, like in the 6th, 7th round. So maybe that doesn't happen because of these signings, but I absolutely expect them to take one on day 2, still as we sit here right now. And then Nick, the last thing here, we got a question from Tom Brocious. He said, do you think Mike Sullivan is well suited for passing coordinator, or is this another situation where the Steelers are saving money by not firing him? I mean, we've seen the Steelers not move on from coaches, be very reluctant to do so and let them just coach out their contracts. Now, don't get me wrong, they will plenty of times not renew deals, but very rarely do we see situations like last year with Matt Canada being fired in season. So I understand where this question is coming from. But what's your take on this whole thing? More so the fit of Mike Sullivan as the pass game coordinator than the second part of that.
I do think they like some things that Mike Sullivan added to the offense after Matt Canada got fired. And so,
Yeah.
listen, I think passing game coordinators have been around for so long at this point. That was not an invention that's been recent. It's something that trickled up from the college level that has really made itself into the NFL level. And if you're not gonna have a passing game coordinator, something is wrong with your staff. The passing game is so important nowadays to what you do in the NFL. It doesn't matter if you're running Arthur Smith's offense, which is a run-heavy, play-action type, or not. The Steelers have been a team that has always felt behind the eight ball a little bit in the pass game concepts. I feel like that's something that they really suffered from with Matt Canada, who had a very poor passing scheme. The spacing was off, right? He ran a lot of different kind of short routes that stopped on the sideline, didn't allow for a ton of yak. Talking about curls, hitches, different things like that. I think Sullivan's kind of there to try and stop that a little bit. And Sullivan is qualified for that in the fact that he's been an OC, added new wrinkles to the passing game. They stole some things in the passing game last year from Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, and Shane Waldron even in Seattle last year. When he took over, they added a few interesting wrinkles to the passing game. So I think that they kind of want to keep that continuity. And we talked about this a little bit too, of why they kept Pat Meyer and why they kept Eddie Fulton. Mike Tomlin's answer about Mike Sullivan stated the global passing game. That's a passing corner pretty clearly, but I think that they wanted to keep some of the stuff they had at the end of last year, during Mason Rudolph's run, for example, that they really liked. They liked the kind of fusion that they had of the McVay run concepts, the passing game concepts that kind of took over from the Shanahan tree and different places. And then they get Arthur Smith, who is adjacent to the McVay tree via working under LaFleur. So I really look at that and say that's probably what they're trying to do here. And so that's why Mike Sullivan stayed on staff. That's why Eddie Faulkner and Pat Meyer are still here. And I think they want to keep some of that continuity with the concepts that they had, because I think Mike Tomlin likes some of that stuff, and I think it aligns with what Arthur Smith wants to do anyways, but maybe Arthur Smith didn't have it fully in his playbook, so they're going to ingratiate. That's kind of how I view those signings. Kind of how I view the signings specifically. Look at Dan Jefferson, right? A guy that has so much experience in a McVay scheme, or they have experience in the Arthur Smith scheme. That is kind of what some of that hints towards to me.
And okay, so the last thing that I want to ask you based off that, because I think it's easy to understand why he was kept on. And Al and I have talked about, obviously the work that he and Eddie Faulkner did, co-running the ship here once Canada was let go. But do you agree with the decision of Mike Sullivan moving into that role? We can understand why it's happening, but do you think that this was for the best, or should they have moved on and cut ties?
Well, I definitely didn't think he should have been back at quarterbacks coach, because if you're going to overhaul the room, if you're going to look at any development and say what went wrong there, the guy that was overseeing that probably shouldn't be back.
Sure.
But I mean, listen, I thought they did some interesting things in the passing game. I don't hate it. I think that, you could have looked at other guys that were out there. I thought that there were some interesting names, like maybe you wanted to add a quarterback guru type to the staff, like a Pep Hamilton, but he never landed a job. I thought Charles London was a candidate when they kind of interviewed him. I like some of the things he did in Tennessee, but I do like the decision to keep Sullivan on the staff, just because I thought the pass game schematics did take a leap. I thought they looked at the right things to kind of fill out that schematic game plan. When you look at what they did with Mason Rudolph at the helm versus what they didn't do with Matt Canada, when Matt Canada was running the ship with Kenny Pickett, what they did was they kind of spaced it out more. They allowed for more move. They allowed for more on the run. They really accentuated Mason Rudolph's strengths by allowing him to push the ball down the field, get George Pickens out running down the field. All of that really worked well. And so it maximized yak and it maximized the ability to create space. And they were using different types of motions. Like they had some of that cheat motion in there from McDaniel. Like they added some of these things, and so I just think some of that continuity. I'm cool with Mike Sullivan being the passing game coordinator. I thought from a quarterback's coach perspective, he didn't do a very good job, but I thought from a coordinator perspective, like I thought he did a fine job. I have a lot of the same opinions about Pat Meyer, where I thought like Pat Meyer from an O-line development, O-line usage standpoint, I have a lot of questions about what he has done. But from like a run game coordinating schematic standpoint, I've liked what they did under his guidance once McCann was gone.
Okay. Yeah. Rojas. And I agree. I don't think that Mike Sullivan should have been let go. I kind of like the decision to keep him on board in this capacity and just add somebody else to be the quarterback coach. So, all right, Nick, good stuff. As always, tell the people where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find me on X, Twitter at Farabaugh FB. Make sure to read stuff at SteelersNow.com and check out all the stuff over there. We're covering the draft, free agency still, all of that stuff that's going to continue to come down the pipe. And subscribe to the YouTube channel.
There we go. And on this YouTube channel, on Steelers Afternoon Drive, the month of April is going to be nuts on the channel with a lot more stuff. And you're going to see Nick right here. You're going to see Derek on here a lot more with Alan and I as we gear up for the 2024 NFL Draft. Like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, hit us in the comments with any thoughts about what we talked about, any questions for a future episode, all that good stuff. Leave us a 5-star review if you're listening somewhere else, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts from. I am Zachary Smith, PGH, for Nick Farabaugh and myself. Thanks for jumping in. Take another ride on the Steelers Afternoon Drive.